Welcome to Eye on Korea, a video podcast produced by the Korea Economic Institute of America. Join us for in-depth conversations with experts and policymakers as we explore issues in Korea's economic and political relationship with the United States and how these issues may influence South Korea's regional strategies and its global relationships. I'm Scott Snyder, President and CEO of KEI, and today I'm joined by Dr. Hyo-young Lee of the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. Dr. Hyo-young Lee is currently Associate Professor at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy, teaching and researching issues on international trade and diplomacy. Before joining KNDA in March 2017, she worked as a research fellow at the Korea Institute of International Economic Policy in the Division of International Trade, and as Assistant Secretary for Trade, Industry, and Energy at the Presidential Office in 2014 and 2015. Welcome to Eye on Korea, Dr. Lee.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're really pleased to have you, and especially because we are meeting very shortly after the conclusion of the announcement of an agreement on tariffs between the U.S. and South Korea. And as everyone knows, the broad outlines of the agreement involve the U.S. establishing a 15% tariff rate with reciprocal tariff rate with Korea, $350 billion in Korean investment pledges, including $150 billion in the shipbuilding sector, $100 billion in LNG-related purchases, and Korean market opening measures, excluding the rice and beef sectors. How do you regard the outcome of the negotiations, both compared to Korea's prior position versus the U.S., and in comparative perspective with other U.S. trading partners such as Japan and the EU?
As you very well know, the announcement of the deal with the U.S. and Japan and U.S. and EU had been made prior, actually 1 week before the Korean negotiations took place. So the results of the deal with Japan and EU had great pressure on Korean negotiators because it sort of set a benchmark of 50% tariffs, and also that involved investment amounts that was actually far beyond what Korea could pledge, considering its size of the economy compared to Japan and EU. And so it was a great pressure on the Korean negotiators. Thankfully, we have been able to reach agreement on the 15% reciprocal tariffs, which is the same level as with Japan and EU. And we've also been able to pledge an investment amount that is comparatively smaller than that of Japan and EU. And so we think that it's been quite successful for us. And we were able to avoid the worst case scenario. And especially not having made any further concessions regarding the further opening of the rice and beef markets have also been considered to be a good job well done for the Korean negotiators, because it is a red line that the Korean negotiators cannot make any concessions on. It's a principle that we try to adhere to from the beginning of the negotiations. And one of the big merits, I think, that the trade deal has provided for the Korean market and companies and the government as a whole is that now we have less uncertainty because we were threatened to be imposed 25% tariffs. Now it's 15%, not as satisfactory for the Korean companies, but at least we have now a more stable environment where we can make business plans according to that new scenario. Actually, President Lee jae-myung mentioned that the deal eliminated uncertainty and set U.S. tariffs on Korea at lower than or at the same level as major competitors, and that we have crossed a big hurdle. So overall, domestically, I think we view the trade deal as being comparatively successful, comparing that to the situation where we had before. And also we had a new administration that came into office only about a month before we entered the negotiations. So considering that the situation was very harsh for Korea, we ended up with a deal that was comparatively satisfactory.
And I also noticed over the weekend that there was pretty high public approval in the initial polling related to the results of the new agreement. Now, in the context of that agreement, KORUS FTA appears to be virtually nullified by the new framework, including the elimination of the zero tariff on Korean auto imports to the U.S. that had given Korea a slight advantage compared to the Japanese and European markets. How sensitive is that concession to accept the same 15% base rate for tariffs compared to Japan and Europe?
As you mentioned, very unfortunately, the Trump administration did not give any consideration of the KORUS FTA that we had signed in 2017 and went into effect in 2012. So it has been in effect for more than 10 years. And there has been no consideration made for that FTA that we had with the U.S. And as you said, we had enjoyed reciprocally zero tariffs on autos, especially. And so this means the trade deal that we reached includes an agreement on 15% auto tariffs, which means that now our Korean car companies no longer enjoy the 0% tariff benefit that they had when they tried to enter the U.S. market. They have to compete more harshly with the Japanese and EU competitors. So they will be very be faced with harsh competition with their Japanese and European car competitors and face less price competitiveness in their products. The Korean government has been actually very disappointed, and they mentioned that we were going for the 12.5% tariff level for autos in consideration of the KORUS FTA that we had. And however, the Trump administration did not accept our request. And actually, it was reported that President Trump said that everyone is 15%. So there seems to have been a universal tariff baseline for auto tariffs in mind when they started the negotiations.
You know, I noticed that Commerce Secretary Lutnick seemed particularly impressed that the Korean trade negotiators even went so far as to travel to Scotland to meet after dinner on the occasion of President Trump's travel to Scotland and the announcement of the deal with the EU. And also, Trade Minister Hyo-young Lee praised Commerce Secretary Lutnick as offering critical advice to the Korean side on how to deal with Trump. What do you make of this intense negotiating dynamic between the two sides, and how might it influence the future of the trade relationship?
I believe that the Korean delegation worked really hard to reach this agreement on the trade, despite the time constraint they had, considering the new administration and the new political appointees that were serving as the Korean delegation in the negotiations. I heard that, as you mentioned, prior to the meeting between Secretary Besant and our Minister Koo Yoon-chul, the Trade Minister and the Minister of MOTI met with Secretary Lutnick at least 3 times in Washington, D.C., New York, and even in Scotland. And I think that made quite a good impression on Secretary Lutnick for the efforts that the Korean delegation have been making. And actually, during the process, they were able to get valuable advice on how to approach the negotiations. And I think they got the advice that Korea had to come up with a very different or unique trade deal that would differentiate them from the deal that was made with Japan and the EU in order to be appealing to President Trump. And I think that it was during that process that the Korean negotiators decided that they would focus on the so-called MASGA project, the Make America Shipbuilding Great Again project, on the Korean and U.S. shipbuilding cooperation agreement. And I also heard that Korean companies and CEOs were very helpful in trying to push the negotiations to come through with a deal. The Vice CEO Hanwha Ocean came to U.S. to provide details with regard to the MASGA project. And there were also deals struck between Tesla and Samsung and LG Energy Solution with regard to semiconductors and batteries, as part, I guess, to support the trade deal to come through. And so I believe that all these efforts would help in the end to push forward the developments and discussions on the details of the trade deal, and that it would fare very well on the bilateral trade relations between U.S. and Korea.
Yeah, well, thank you for mentioning the shipbuilding sector, because I do think that was a really distinctive element of the announcement with Korea that was different from what we've seen in the Japan and Europe announcements. Another distinctive aspect of the U.S.-Korea negotiation, I think, is that President Trump claimed on Truth Social that Korea has opened its agricultural markets, but the Korean government has claimed that the U.S. accepted Korea's request not to push on the Korean rice and beef markets. How do you anticipate that potential difference might play out, especially since President Lee and President Trump will be meeting in a few weeks here in Washington?
The Korean Presidential Office Policy Chief Kim Yong-bum has mentioned in his press brief that despite this discrepancy in expressions, there is actually no change in the facts that Korea did not make any concessions to further open its rice and beef market. And so, and he also mentioned that he understood President Trump's remarks as a way of expression by the political leader. And so I think basically there seems to be an understanding that there is no discrepancy in the fact that we have not made any concessions on further opening of the rice and beef market. However, he also explained that the U.S. President Trump might be explaining or mentioning about Korea's pledge to improve the non-tariff barriers with regard to the agricultural sector, because according to press reports, there have been agreement or commitment by the Korean side to improve the quarantine process for certain agricultural products that are being shipped by the U.S. Namely, there seem to be 10 items that are subject to more strict quarantine process, like apples or pears or strawberries. So there seems to have been an agreement that there would be improved or streamlined inspection procedures for these types of U.S. agricultural products. So maybe he was mentioning about that in his expression.
Now, another, I think, area of ambiguity as related to the agreement is really about the modality of the investments and how those investments might be chosen. And of course, we have also seen some discrepancy in the U.S.-Japan agreement as related to precisely how investments might be chosen. And I think that President Trump in that case mentioned a golden share, which would apparently give him sole discretionary authority over what investments can be made. And there's also, I think, some discrepancy about how returns on investments can be used. And so I'm wondering how you see that set of issues and how they might play out in the U.S.-Korea case.
There's certainly the $200 billion investment portion of the $350 billion investment amount that we pledged has to be decided upon. And President Trump, as you mentioned, said that he will directly select the sectors that will receive the investment, whereas the Korean government mentioned certain industries such as semiconductors or batteries, biotechnology, and nuclear energy. These are actually all sectors that are deemed to be strategically important for both the U.S. and the Korea, and that those are strategic sectors that are strategically important, but also will help to increase the competitiveness of the U.S. manufacturing industry. And so these are all industries that need to be invested in. So I think that basically they weren't differing in terms of what sectors they will be investing on, but perhaps I think the Korean government might have provided an illustrative list of sectors that can be subject to the investments. And with regard to the profit structure of the investments, there may have been discrepancies. Secretary Lutnick had made remarks that 90% of the profit will go to the American people. And the policy chief mentioned that he understood this remark to imply that the profits may be reinvested, that 90% of the investment, the profits will be reinvestment in the U.S. rather than being retrieved by the Korean companies, which is usually the case. So I think the details need to be discussed more, of course, but I think that is basically what the Korean government is perceiving about the remarks that have been made by Secretary Lutnick. And I think that these details may not necessarily be discussed at the summit level because it's like a little bit awkward for the leaders of the two countries discussing about these profit structures. And I don't think they have the expertise either. So I think that these details will be discussed at the working level. And then more likely that these terms will be put into an agreement for the two leaders to sign, perhaps, at the summit meeting.
Well, it certainly makes sense that some of the specific details should be worked out between the two governments. But President Trump did also mention in his Truth Social post the expectation that he would meet with President Lee within 2 weeks. It does look like that schedule is sliding somewhat. But based on what you said previously, what do you think are the outstanding areas that the two leaders themselves would actually talk about related to the tariff agreement when they have a chance to meet here in Washington?
Well, with regard to the tariff agreement, I think they will first congratulate each other on the investment project, and especially they focus on the MASCA project, with which the Korean delegation offered. And they would talk maybe more in detail about what kind of areas in shipbuilding that the U.S. needs. I believe that there is a lot of shortage in the U.S. shipbuilding industry with regard to expertise in the shipbuilding labor, and also increasing the infrastructure for shipbuilding, like shipyards, and strengthening the supply chain for shipbuilding, etc. And so maybe they would, in a more broader way, discuss these issues on how to make these investments possible. But there are reports coming out that the summit may focus more on the security issues and the bilateral security relationship between the two countries rather than the trade deal itself, because I think it's now the perception of the Korean government that trade issues have now been settled by agreeing on the trade deal, and that the details of the trade deal will have to be worked on at the working level. And so the security issues may be more of the more appropriate issue for the two leaders to discuss, because it has been raised consistently by President Trump and the members of the U.S. administration that they have interest in talking about increasing the defense spending and defense cost burden sharing, and talking about the role of the USFK. So basically, they mentioned the term modernizing the alliance. So I think that may be the main issue that the leaders may talk about. And I think that considering the possibility that President Trump might try to use the trade deal as a leverage to push Korea on the security issues, it may be a good idea to have a finalized trade deal text for the leaders to sign before the summit or at the summit, and so that the details of the trade deal may be better worked out at the working level, and of course reviewed by the government leaders. But I think that it would be better for both sides to concentrate on the security issues than trying to link between the trade issues and the security issues.
Okay, so it sounds like the economic bureaucrats are still going to be burning the midnight oil if they have that short a timeline for reaching a final agreement.
As you mentioned, it's now rumors that they will happen in maybe late August.
That's right. So they have a little bit more time, but still it's a big agenda, because there are also a couple of other issues, I think, that were mentioned in the course of reporting that didn't really appear in the framework. And so I'm wondering if you can highlight for us additional outstanding issues that really have yet to be addressed as part of ongoing negotiations between the two governments.
Right. The recent trade negotiations actually did not cover the issue of digital trade, which actually has been raised very often by, I guess, by the U.S. government. The USTR NTE report, the National Trade Estimate Report, actually lists some of the digital trade issues that the U.S. deems as trade barriers for U.S. big tech companies. And they include like Korean regulations on government cloud services, the legislation on network usage fees, or the upcoming or the efforts to legislate the regulation on online platforms, and also regulations on transferring map data to overseas data centers, so-called Google Map issue. So all these perceived as big tech regulations that may serve unfavorable to American big tech companies. But for the Korean side, there are also data security issues and data sovereignty issues. So considering the difficulty in reaching agreement on these digital trade barriers issues, I think they have not had enough time to discuss. So I guess it wasn't included in the trade negotiations recently. I also think that there is a lot of discussion and issue solving to be made on the sectoral tariffs. Auto tariffs have been agreed at 15%, but we still have this urge to downgrade the tariff level. And also the steel tariffs, 50%. It's quite a burden on Korean companies. And considering that we are going to work on the Mazga project, steel products are necessary for the shipbuilding industry. And so I think Korean companies would like to reinstate the steel quota that they had, at least for the steel that go into the shipbuilding industry. So those could be issues that could come up. Of course, Section 232 tariffs on semiconductors, which are not yet announced, they could also be an issue. So these sectoral tariff issues may be a more important issue for trade negotiations between Korea and the US. And also there's the issue of export controls. It's not a purely trade issue, but it involves the supply chain for semiconductors. So, and the recently announced AI action plan by the Trump administration also has implications for strengthening the export controls. So I think that we may also need to discuss these issues as well in the upcoming trade negotiations.
Yeah, well, those are some very thorny issues that I can imagine could be hard to negotiate on. So we'll have to keep our eye on that. Given the level of commitments that the Korean government made as related to investments in the United States, how do you see the Korean private sector's view of those investments? Because obviously they are critical partners. And in fact, they are the executors potentially of a lot of those kinds of projects.
Well, as I mentioned, the trade deal involves agreement on a 15% auto tariff, and that is a great price disadvantage for the Korean companies, which enjoyed 0% tariffs on their car exports to the U.S. market. And so it is inevitably a bad situation for our Korean companies. And also there has been recently the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which includes the decision to repeal IRA subsidies, which obviously will have a grave impact on Korean firms' decision to invest in building EV electric vehicle factories in the U.S. So in response to these changing circumstances, I think the Korean companies are planning to adjust. For example, Hyundai Motors appears to have recently announced its plan to increase its production of car parts to be produced within the United States territory instead of importing them from Korea or other countries in order to cope with the increased tariffs and to minimize the negative impact of the tariffs as well. And also Kia, in response to the repeal of the IRA subsidies, has reportedly plans to increase its production of hybrid cars instead of purely EV cars, and also perhaps increase more the production of diesel and gasoline cars, because that's the direction that the Trump government is trying to pursue. I think all in all, they're trying to cope with increased tariffs, by increasing production in the United States. And so the exports will not be able to come in, so increase car production and car parts production within the U.S. territory.
No, that'll be a very interesting area to watch, I think, as Korean companies grapple with the shift in energy policy from the Biden to the Trump administration.
But of course, that doesn't mean that there will be negative consequences for the Korean car industry within Korea, because it could mean hollowing out of the domestic car industry in Korea. And there's already very negative response from domestic car component companies in Korea about this news in order to cope with the new tariff situation.
Well, another topic that we'll have to revisit on Eye on Korea. I want to close by asking you mentioned earlier about modernizing the alliance and the possibility that the summit might actually end up primarily focusing on defense and security issues with the idea that we've closed the chapter on tariff negotiations. But I have to ask you, because the shipbuilding actually seems to be a connector between the tariff negotiation and the possibility of reframing defense industrial cooperation and defense burden sharing. Do you see any other ways in which the economic dimension of the relationship and the recent framework agreements might influence the way in which the presidents might talk about forging a new defense cooperation framework?
Well, I guess this is all based on speculation because there's not much detail reported with regard to the security issue between the two countries. I think that we may need to have a reevaluation of the defense costs that Korea is providing right now, because it may not be taking into account the unofficial accounts or unofficial costs that Korea is providing for the USFK in terms of infrastructure or the opportunity costs of the Korean USFK soldiers, for example. So there, I think, Scott, you already mentioned that. I'm borrowing your remarks, actually, because I'm not the defense security expert here. So spare me from the details. But I think there has to be some discussion on how to reframe the U.S.-Korea defense framework so that we can talk about this modernizing the alliance in a more structural, fundamental way. And with regard, I think that initially the Korean government or maybe the defense national security advisor tried to link the trade issue with the security issue in order to gain more advantage in the negotiations. But I think that that kind of position has now shifted somewhat. What I can say for now is that the current position of the Korean government seems to be that trade is not a matter to be linked with the security issues, because it has proved that it may serve disadvantageously for the Korean side if President Trump tries to use it as a leverage in pushing Korea with regard to security issues. So I think that it may be better for the Korean side to try to de-link trade and security issues, and that the details will have to be more likely, the details for the trade deal will more likely or better be dealt by at the working level, although the issues are so broad and so difficult to discuss. I think at the summit level, the leaders would have to talk more about the broad framework for our bilateral relationship in terms of modernizing an alliance, and also with regard to investments, how, in a broader way, how we want the investments to happen. Shipbuilding might be an important area. Maybe we should also talk about semiconductors as well, because it's an area where Korea can contribute to the U.S. semiconductor manufacturing competitiveness, and also AI. Nuclear energy is another area where Korea wants to contribute. So all these technology-related manufacturing sectors, I think, can be served as competitive areas for the two countries to work together to meet their mutual benefits.
Okay, well, You've listed a lot of areas that we're going to have to come back to as part of our program. I want to thank you, Dr. Lee, for joining us on Eye on Korea for a great review of the U.S.-Korea tariff agreement. And also thank you for joining us on Eye on Korea. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like the podcast, subscribe so you won't miss the next one, and leave a review to help others discover the show. Follow the Korea Economic Institute of America on social media or visit keia.org for more resources, events, and expert analysis on Korea. We'll see you next time on Eye on Korea.